Good evening, and once again, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to another Taubman Symposium in Jewish Studies. We could not have two better people to help us understand the issues and the processes that are now taking place between my friend Raith Alamari and Ambassador Dennis Ross. There are several decades of direct experience with the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and with negotiations. So let me begin with an open question to the two of you by asking to tell us about, or to talk to us about why earlier rounds of negotiations were unsuccessful or were unable to achieve a comprehensive agreement.
If you look at Annapolis, you know, my problem with Annapolis was that there was good news and bad news. The good news was you actually had a serious negotiation that was done by the parties for a year. The bad news was, as time went on, the political authority of Ehud Olmert was declining all the time. After the Lebanon conflict, you know, he basically lost his credibility within Israel. You know, his approval ratings were in the single-digit area. At one point, you know, I said it was actually within the margin of error of the poll. And so he's then in a position where he doesn't have great political authority. Olmert has a parallel approach with Abu Mazen. At one point, he puts a proposal on the table, and Abu Mazen never responds to it. Now, you can say he didn't respond to it because he said, look, if I respond to it and I agree to it, I'm dealing with a guy who probably can't deliver what he's putting on the table. You think that Abu Mazen can ever agree to anything? Look at what Olmert was prepared to offer, and he doesn't even draw a response. And the essence of this question was, is he really up to making a deal? One of the things I've often described is in all the negotiations that I conducted with them, I always was struck by the sense of the weight of history on their shoulders. You know, we can sit here and we can be highly rational and highly analytical, and we can talk about the logic of doing this and why it makes sense, and we can talk about what is the way to resolve each of these issues as if we're in a laboratory. But they're not in a laboratory. They exist in a real world where all these issues, the core issues, and particularly the narrative issues of Jerusalem and refugees, are part of historic narratives that have been told over and over and over again. And you now, as a leader, have to take on history and mythology. And to say it's daunting is an understatement. So you require leaders who decide that they're going to make history. And the question is, do you have leaders who are prepared to do that?
I would say, first of all, I think part of it is that the issues themselves were not always ripe. We did not always know what is the solution to all of these issues. It's easy today to say that we know what the contours of a peace deal would look like, or at least we know what are the menu of options of how different issues will be dealt with. That was not always the case until we get to a point where we got to know what the issues are. But that took us time. And I would even say in Camp David, we were pushing and exploring some of the ideas. What seemed, you know, impossible at the beginning of Camp David, we actually had some breakthroughs. Jerusalem being one issue, where it became very clear at the end that this is an issue that we can work with. So I think part of why we haven't managed to get the solution in the past is we didn't know what the actual doability, what's the margin that either side can play with. I don't know, I think it's a mistake to say that we know the solution, but at least we know what are the range of possibilities on each of the issues, and therefore coming up with this, you know, building this jigsaw is not as difficult as it was maybe 10 years ago. The other issue that also you touched upon, Dennis, is the issue of political ripeness. Political readiness. And one of the actual, you know, tragedies of this conflict is we've never had the political timelines synchronized between the two sides. In my experience, again, with the negotiations of '99 until the collapse after Taba, is You know, at the beginning of this process, I think Arafat had the political capital to actually go and do it. He had built it up in the years before. He had built it up in the way he dealt with Netanyahu, and then when Barak came here. Yet, as you mentioned, Barak was busy working the Syrian track. By the time that Barak started paying attention to the Palestinian track, by that time, I think Arafat was already, as you mentioned, in shaky grounds, and therefore, we had missed that moment. Equally with the Abbas Olmert. When Abbas first came to power, it took him time to consolidate, etc. By the time he got to a point where he was ready to move forward, Olmert was gone by that time. Neither side truly understood the damage that they were doing to the other side by certain behavior. You mentioned the issue of the suicide bombings and the issue, and I would take it a bit even larger than that. And I would say, for the longest time, Palestinian leadership did not understand how the failure to really impose security, how fundamentally it undermined Israeli trust. But by and large, there was no understanding from the Palestinian side of how deep the issue of security was vis-à-vis Israel, and the flip. Of course, on the Israeli side, they never understood how damaging the issue of settlements is to the Palestinian narrative. I was at the AIPAC conference on Sunday, and I kept on hearing over and over from some of the questioners and some people who came after the session, all these arguments to convince me that the settlements are not the real problem. And I was struck, because at the end of the day, give me all of the rational arguments that you want to give me. I know for Palestinians, seeing the settlement expansion is the clearest indication for them that the Israelis are not serious. Politics is not always about rational analysis. It is about the perceptions, and the perception on the Palestinian side was the issue that settlements indicated the Israelis were not serious. So we had a long time where the two sides really did not understand what made the other one tick. Most leaders are just politicians who respond to the kind of incentive that any politician responds to. You talked about Abu Mazen and Olmert. If I was Abu Mazen's advisor at that point, I would have advised him to take the risk, say yes, and turn the next Israeli election, knowing that Olmert is over, yet say yes and turn the next Israeli election into a referendum on peace. Yet, this is the kind of leap of faith and risk-taking that you could not expect from your typical politician. And today, we have two leaders. We have Netanyahu, we have Abbas, two leaders who I believe realize, maybe not enthusiastically, not with great joy, but realize that they have to reach peace. Yet these are not leaders who take the kind of risk, these kind of grand gestures that we are used to. And I think this is where in this place, where you have serious diplomacy with leaders who want to move, but who are not willing to take great risks. And sadly, a public that is not excited by a process that they see as a slow process that is very... from which they are quite detached. You don't see the ability of the leaders to excite the public as we saw in the 90s and beyond that. And I think this is one moment we're in, and I think if we start working on maturing the issues, preparing a public, and being sensitive to how certain acts on either side plays on the other side, we might be in a place where we might be able to avoid some of these mistakes that we had done in the past.
Well, what is the framework going to look like?
Either side want to be in a position where the finger is pointed and they are the ones who are told that you're not going to have peace. We're going to have, I think, a deal. This is it's dangerous to predict in this business, but I will predict and will say that probably the sides will say yes. The big question for me, though, is the day after they say yes, what's going to happen on the ground? How do you sell it? How do you sell a deal that makes a lot of sense in diplomatic terms, yet doesn't give you anything concrete to go to the public the next day and say, your life is going to change? The way I've always seen a peace deal working is, you get a peace deal, an implementable one. Yes, we're going to give up on this issue and that issue, but every time I'm assailed by the Hamas or what have you, saying that you sold out on this or that, I will respond to this by saying, yes, but look at the Israeli tanks rolling out of the West Bank. Look at all of the assistance coming in from the Arab world, from the Gulf states, and from the international community. I am giving you a state. Abbas will not be able to say that to his public, nor would Netanyahu, of course, be able to give the victory speech to his public the next day. So for me, as we think of this diplomatic tool, it is very important to think of what we can attach to it to make a difference on the ground. Sometimes when we have a product, by the way, selling a peace deal is like selling anything. it's an act of marketing. And sometimes when you have a product that is not very compelling, you have to give it some good packaging. And you have to add in maybe, a free gift every time you buy the product. So as we do this, what are the free gifts that we can put into place to allow both sides to actually go sell the peace process, this framework, and be able to stay in the negotiating table and to start the real business of negotiating a deal?
What produced the Clinton Parameters, and I was the main author of the Clinton Parameters, was an enormous amount of time that we spent with both sides. So we really were in a position to know, all right, not what they wanted, because you don't reconcile wants when you're negotiating or mediating something like this. You're reconciling needs. We got to the point where we could understand what the needs were. The bad news is there's some real gaps. And they're not artificial, and they respond to what each side feels they need, and it's not easy to bridge those gaps. In the best case, the day after, in both societies right now, is going to be a whole lot like the day before. The bigger problem we face is that there's profound disbelief on each side. This is the 20th year of Oslo. I mean, we're past the 20th year. That was 1993. This is 2014. Most of the, both sides basically, the publics on each side say, I've seen this movie, and I don't much like it. And they're not seeing a payoff from it. Israelis look at Palestinians and they say, they don't really believe in two states. They believe in a Palestinian state and a binational state. And Palestinians look at Israelis and they say, they clearly don't believe in two states. If they did, why are they building in our state? So it's the disbelief issue that you're going to have to take on in the best case. Something has to change, I'll say, in the first days and weeks afterwards, to say to each public, no, something's different this time. Yes, you've seen this movie before, but this is a different movie. Something is different this time. And for Palestinians, they need to see that something's actually changing on the ground. They need to see, as an example, even though this is not something that they're going to do handstands over, if the Israelis were only building within the blocks and only the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem, the Israeli position would be, we're not going to build in your state. We're not building anywhere in what we think should be your state. Okay, maybe you disagree on the size of the blocks, but we're going to negotiate the size of the blocks. But we are not going to build in your state. And we do some other things to show that we mean what we say. So we'll build more housing within the confines of what is Israel. And we'll begin to create incentives for those who live beyond the blocks to come back as a way of showing we mean what we say. And in Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, we're going to allow Palestinians now to engage in extensive economic activity, something they can't do today, as a way of saying, we really don't want to control you. And on the Palestinian side, if they would do things that address the Israeli perception. The level of incitement in the Palestinian media is outrageous. It's outrageous. And it tells the Israeli public they're not ready. They're not getting ready for peace. It fortifies the view that this is not about really two states. The fact that you can't find Israel on a Palestinian Authority map hardly provides reassurance to Israelis that they mean what they say about two states. The fact that there's no preparation of the public for the idea that compromise is a legitimate thing doesn't provide any reassurance. The point is, you need to create a specific set of steps that each side will take to address the concerns of the other about the disbelief of the other's commitment to two states. For these two leaders to have a context in which they then get ready at a certain point to take on history and mythology won't exist. You need to change that context. Well, one of the most profound lessons from the past is what the two of us are saying in slightly different ways. You better change the context. You better create a basis for belief. You better create a basis that shows, peacemaking pays off. And it's for real. Right now, neither one of them can show
Is
that.
there do we get any sense of what these core issues, as you describe them, might look like in the framework?
Look, on territory, you're going to have the 67 borders with swaps will be the basis on which you begin to sort things out. There's 120 settlements in the West Bank. Okay, I'm talking about outside Jerusalem. 120 settlements in the West Bank. To put this in perspective, 4 settlements constitute 45% of the settlement population, the settler population. 4 out of 120. So when you start talking about blocks, and you're talking about within 5 to 6% of the West Bank, close to what's the green line, you can accommodate 80% of the settlers. Not 80% of the settlements, but 80% of the settlers. So what you're talking about is, all right, you're going to end up with 67 that gets adjusted. It's not going to be the June 467 lines, because they're going to be blocks that are incorporated into Israel so that they can incorporate 80% of the settlers. In compensation for those blocks, there's going to be territory that's then given to the Palestinian state. And that you'll work out the border based on how you define the blocks and how you define the swap. On security, the Israelis are going to have to know several things. They're going to have to know that, there isn't going to be infiltration of terror. There isn't going to be building of rockets within the West Bank. You see what rockets from Gaza do? Think about the West Bank. The West Bank sits astride every Israeli populated area. If rockets could be fired from the West Bank, you can't fly into Ben Gurion Airport. You think the Israelis are going to accept an outcome that leaves that open? No chance. And it will involve some kind of Israeli presence in the Jordan River, the length of time to be determined. From an Israeli standpoint, every Israeli prime minister who was serious about this focused on the Jordan River as a security perimeter, partly because Israel has no strategic depth. There'll be some kind of presence there. How long? What's the criteria that will be used to determine the point at which they no longer need to be there? Abu Mazen wants a date certain for when Israel withdraws. Israel wants it to be criteria and circumstances driven, performance driven, so that Israel, when it leaves that area, is a function of when the context or circumstances makes it possible and safe to do so. So the security arrangements are going to have to be worked out to take those kinds of issues into account. Early warning issues, how you deal with airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, because actually that affects the ability to ensure that your ability to talk to your own military forces isn't disrupted. Refugees, look, if there's a right of return, then you don't have a two-state solution. So you're going to come up with some kind of compensation for those who will not be returning to Israel. They'll have a right of return to their own state. And there'll probably be a set of circumstances under which a limited number, where the Israelis are the ones who can make the decision, are allowed to return to Israel, either under a humanitarian rubric, some family reunification basis, something of that sort that keeps the numbers small. And on Jerusalem, look, at the end of the day, as hard as it is, you're going to get the Palestinians to agree to an outcome where they don't have a capital. You're going to have to have one city that is not divided again, because we're not going to go back to that. But you're going to have a city that has 2 capitals for 2 states. I mean, roughly those are the broad principles. Now, are we at a point where the 2 sides can sign up to something like that? I would say that, just putting it simply, Abu Mazen will find it very difficult to accept some of what Israel is requiring on security. He'll find it very difficult to accept the outcome that I just described on refugees. Bibi will find it very difficult to deal with what I just said on Jerusalem. So, you can get a sense of the boundaries within which you're approaching these issues, but this sort of reinforces the point that the 2 of us were making about you're probably not at that stage where the 2 sides can accept something along the lines that I just outlined.
Guess what they're going to fudge. You said what they're going to say. Let me guess what they're going to fudge. On the issue of borders, yes, they will agree to 67. They will agree to land swaps. What they will fudge is, what's the ratio of land swaps? Palestinians want, for every kilometers that the Israelis take, to give 1 kilometer within Israel. The Israelis don't want that. So you'll end up with some kind of language, I think, which will indicate some degree of parity, but not equality. So I think this is one thing where we'll see things fudged. On security, I think it all goes down now to the Jordan River. So the issue becomes the Jordan River, and on that one, I suspect that what you mentioned, the Israelis wanting a performance-based trigger and the Palestinians wanting a date certain, that will be fudged. They will be talking about an Israeli presence for a transitional period, which, by the way, the Palestinians have accepted. Abbas recently talked about 5 years, and leave this for future negotiations. I think on Jerusalem is going to be the most difficult, because that's the circle that really cannot be squared. And I suspect that we will have some kicking down the road situation. Refugees, I think we will have clarity on some of the practical issues, but what we will be stuck with, whether on Jerusalem or refugees or on the new issue that was presented, the issue of Jewish state, we'll be stuck with what do you do with these symbolic components? With all of these rational, practical things, we can find a win-win, or at least, semi-win-win formulations. It is these symbolic issues that will be most difficult. I think some issues simply cannot be negotiated. And I think we will get to a point of complete deadlock when we try to negotiate, say, on the issue of refugees. What is the genesis of the issue of refugees? What was 1948? And how can you negotiate something like this? When 1948, in Arabic, is called the Nakba, the catastrophe. For any Israeli, it was the year where the diaspora ended and the homeland was created. How do you negotiate that? It's impossible. So I think, in a sense, one of the breakthroughs that we have not done is how to start taking some of these narrative issues and move them from the realm of negotiations, which by definition entails the willingness to compromise, and how can you compromise on narrative and identity, and move it to the realm of a different process of sensitization, whereby the Jewish connection to the land, for example, is something that the Palestinian public gets exposed to and starts understanding. The Palestinian, how Palestinians relate to 1948 and to the trauma of 48 becomes something that the Israelis are familiar with and sensitized to. I think this is where a lot of the difficulty that we're facing today, and we will face even more when we get to the issue of negotiating a treaty, will be. And I think this is something that maybe we'll fudge right now, but as long as we this remains in the realm of the negotiation, I think we will end up in a situation where we cannot reach agreement on some of these issues.
Communities have very powerful rejectionists who completely reject the idea of any kind of compromise. Any, to use your term and Dennis's term, the issues of the power of narratives. How will Mahmoud Abbas and Netanyahu and also John Kerry negotiate and marginalize those very powerful rejectionists who could stand as very significant impediments to moving forward, any forward movement?
Frankly, some of the rejectionists you will have to deal with in the good old security way. They will shoot, and you'll have to shoot back. We have to understand that there will be that, and ultimately, the rejectionists can reject, and they will use violence. Yet I think that the message that they will give will not have much traction if we have a deal that is credible, that is signed on by credible leaders, that has within it the credible promise of change of reality for the public on both sides.
You have to show something's different. That's part of preparing the ground for doing a deal. And that's part of the way you also deal with the rejectionists, because you build the constituencies who favor this outcome. And that's something that has to be done. It is something that is easier to do in Israel than it is on the Palestinian side, because the political culture on the Palestinian side is simply different. And for a whole lot of reasons, there's a deeper sense of grievance, there's a deeper sense of victimhood, there's a deeper sense that, making compromise isn't somehow legitimate, it's somehow betraying who you are, it's betraying your principles. It becomes a harder thing to do on their side, so you don't see the preparation in advance. But there needs to be, within the bounds of what's possible, there needs to be steps along those lines. So if you want to take on the rejectionists, you have to create a context in which you make it harder and harder for them to deal. You make them less and less legitimate. You build the constituencies for peace, you act to discredit who they are, and then you'll find, by the way, it's easier to take them on.
What's interesting is that both leaders, Netanyahu and Abbas, have said good things, but too few and too far between. And I think it's easier for both of them if you remind them of what they said in the past, and if you insist that they repeat it more frequently and more loudly, is to convince them and maybe to nudge them and to push them to actually do it consistently and repeatedly.
And connect it.
Of course.
When one does it, respond. I mean, every time one of them has said a positive thing, it's like they just tossed a rock in the ocean and it's sunk. And then it's not repeated. Now, you can also understand why they don't repeat it, because they get flack for saying it, and they get no reinforcement. They get no benefit for having done it. It is not enough to work out how you're going to get over the hump with the framework. That itself has to be tied to a set of very clear things that are going to be done that shows it's a different world the day after this is done than the world before it.
You know, I think you'll agree with me that for the last hour and 20 minutes, we have had a very rare opportunity to see two very gifted and experienced people talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in ways that in the end give at least me a degree of optimism. I underscore a degree of optimism.